Uh, Good morning, everybody. Thanks for your attention in the lesson on Monday, in which we nearly finished that lesson about we've done a series of 4 lessons, haven't we, about the West German economic miracle. So we didn't quite get to the end. With the very last strand, we didn't finish. So I said that I would do an additional video, which I'd upload to YouTube, that finishes that off. So that's what this is about now. So hope you're all well. I put my own image on. I just thought it'd be nice to vary the format a little bit. So, but I'll take my image off now, and we'll just proceed as usual. So if you can make sure you've got the mind map in front of you and the notes, and we'll just sort of wrap up the concluding strand to this topic about the West German economic miracle. Okay, so I'll take myself off the screen now, and then we'll move on. Okay, so there's a summary of what we've covered so far. Again, just ever so quick recap. So we started off looking at the post-war devastation, the assumptions that were there at the beginning that in 1945, after the incredible damage that was wrought on Germany, that the assumption was that the new Germany would never really recover, let alone did people understand that within 15 years, at least half of Germany, the West German half, would be the leading economic country in Europe. Okay, so it was a miracle, or it was seen as a miracle when that actually happened. And obviously the Cold War context was a big part of that, because Germany was split into two. The eastern part of Germany became the German Democratic Republic, and we'll do more lessons on that, but the economy in East Germany did not revive in anywhere near the same way. But the new West Germany that was created in 1949, for a whole range of different reasons, accelerated. And a big part of that, of course, is that economic acceleration in the 1950s was the fact that West Germany was at the front line in the Cold War. And so it was to the best interests of the Americans and the British to sort of ensure that West Germany did prosper and grow. And so that sort of support we talked about was the Marshall Aid. That was a package that was offered to all European countries, but in particular West Germany clearly benefited from it. But there were lots and lots of other factors that we've looked at. This sort of idea that actually the damage was less than had originally been thought. Much of the old Germany's raw materials and her industrial infrastructure actually lay in the western zones. That obviously helped. For example, the Ruhr industrial area. But also the leadership of this new West German country that was created in 1949 introduced very innovative economic policies, a sort of halfway house between the traditional free market economy, the traditional sort of allowing economic growth to develop naturally through market forces, but also aspects of state intervention, and finding a sort of middle way through all of that. The so-called social market economy, but also the currency reform was a big factor. And then we finished off last lesson by really focusing in on the structural problems, and sort of getting that sort of sense that actually it wasn't a linear progress from 1948 to 1963. There were lots of peaks and troughs, ups and downs, and it wasn't just peaks and troughs over time. It was also geographically that there were some aspects of Germany, of West Germany, that never really saw an economic miracle, particularly the sort of like northern regions where there were lots of refugees and expellees, but also in terms of sectoral differences, some aspects, for example, forestry and agriculture, never really had an economic miracle. It kind of depended on what type of industry we were talking about. So all of those factors are important, okay? So that's 4 or 5 minutes there. What we covered in 3 hours of teaching, and so 4 hours of teaching. And so what we're now going to focus in on is this final strand, okay, reconstruction and modernisation. It's a kind of like catch-all strand, just bringing together some of the sort of key conclusions and mopping up other things that you need to know about with regards this economic miracle. So let's go through, okay. So in a nutshell, what are the key points that we need to cover here? The economic boom had several key features, okay. For example, the role of the central bank, we've covered that, okay. The emphasis on the production of machine tools and cars, okay, so that's worth knowing. We'll pick that one up, okay. So the economic miracle focused on all sorts of manufacturing production, but in particular machine tools and cars, and also the fact that it was triggered by the outbreak of the Korean War, okay. So we'll look at that sort of short-term trigger and why that was important. There are lots of reasons for the economic miracle, and we've covered those, okay. Currency reform, social market economy, existing infrastructure, Cold War context, the role of the individual like Earhart, etc. Okay, although historians debate whether it was merely a continuity of old World War II trends, or whether it had unique characteristics which mark it as a post-war turning point. Okay, so there's that. So we've considered that sort of notion many times in this A-level course, that when you have historical change, there's different types of change. And one type of change is what we call a turning point, where genuinely it marked a new beginning, and something suddenly happened that caused a change. But then the other type of change is what we call continuity, and actually the point there is that it wasn't something that happened at one point in time that caused the economic miracle, for example, that actually there was a continuity, that there was an economic improvement that was already happening before 1948, in which case what we actually see happening in the 1950s is an acceleration of an existing trend that was there before. And that's that sort of like notion we touched upon last lesson, that actually there was, if you look at the bigger picture from 1871, broadly speaking, there was generally economic improvement that was actually happening ever since 1871. It was interrupted at intervals, in particular the Great Depression of 1929 to the early 1930s, and of course World War II was a downturn in Germany's broader economic development. But arguably you could say that the economic miracle merely picked up on a general trend of improvement that had been happening for 70 or 80 years, beginning in 1871, and therefore the 1950s was an acceleration of an existing trend. Okay, so that's that. And then the final sentence there: historians, however, agree that American influence was a crucial driving force. Okay, for example, the Marshall Aid Programme, and of course the Cold War context, which was very much supported by America, and also that the expanding West German economy had a huge contribution on the developing of the European economic community. Okay, so that's again the significance, and I touched upon that last lesson right at the very end. Felt a little bit rushed, so we'll develop that one a bit more. But why are you learning about the West German economic miracle? Is in a sense what we're saying. You're probably thinking, well, this is something that happened in the 1950s, a long time ago. Why is it important? Well, the importance is it's still with us today, because that economic miracle of the 1950s in West Germany fueled the growth of the EEC, the European Economic Community. And of course the European Economic Community is there today. It's hugely important. I mean, Britain has just left it, and the huge debate about whether that was the right thing to do. Okay, so all of those things in a nutshell. So let's again unpick, and you can pause the YouTube video and take the time to sort of map out the key things. Okay, so there's so this is just drilling into more detail. So key features of the economic boom: Triggered, first of all, it was triggered by the Korean War. Okay, so there's that. That's a good word to use in your historical when you're writing essays, isn't it? If you're looking at the short-term cause, the short-term cause is why did this happen at that moment in time? What was the immediate factor? Okay, that triggered it. Another phrase we often use is like a catalyst. Okay, so what sort of like suddenly made this accelerated growth happen? And there's general agreement that the Korean War broke out in June 1950. And that led to a sharp increase in West German industrial production, which led to a decline in unemployment. So the Korean War created lots of jobs for West German people. Okay, well, why did it do that? Because there was obviously a huge demand by the Western allies, the Americans, etc., for the production of materials, resources, weapons, etc., that could be used in that particular war. Okay, so a couple of statistics there: a drop from 1.9 million unemployed, it dropped just to 200,000 11 years later. Okay, kind of gives you that sort of idea. So there was rapid and sustained growth between 1950 and 55. Remember this idea of peaks and troughs? A little bit of a dip in the mid-1950s until, say, 1955 to about 1958. That sort of growth slowed down a little bit. But then it began to pick up again, and again, the year 1960 saw a particular boom year, okay, in West German economic growth. Point C, the central bank played a key role, managing the money supply. I've used that image, haven't I, several times. If you imagine money is like water that lubricates the economy, and basically the central bank is like the tap, okay, turning the flow on and off, or regulating it, slowing it down, speeding it up, okay. So that's a hugely important part. And the discount rates to ensure inflation did not result. Okay, so it's very much the way, for example, the Bank of England operates today. The Bank of England will set the sort of minimum lending rate, and that's a way of ensuring. So that's a way of ensuring that you manage and control inflation. Okay, obviously, if lending rates go up, if you've got to pay more interest to borrow money, then that could possibly fuel the rise of wages and the rise of prices and cause an inflationary spiral, which you don't want to result. So all of that is managed by a central bank. And then the other key feature of the economic boom was the fact that West Germany became sort of like the main supplier around the world for machine tools and motor cars, motor vehicles in general. Okay, that West Germany became the lead producer of sort of high quality manufactured goods made out of steel. West Germany was in a very, very strong position to provide those types of goods, and we've picked up that ever since we started the course. If you think about it, one of our very first lessons in year 12 was about Germany's natural resources, in particular the Ruhr, R-U-H-R industrial area, the expertise in electronics and in fertilizer chemicals, high quality sort of precision instruments, etc. Well, that sort of experience and wealth of expertise was playing its part now, 80 years later, in West Germany's economic miracle. So a few examples there. West Germany was a big exporter of motor vehicles by 1950. Her export of motor vehicles had reached pre-war levels, and by 1955 was 5 times more than her export levels before the war. Okay, so it gives you a sense of that, how important that became. Mechanical engineering by 1958, 40%, that's nearly half of everything that West Germany produced in her factories was produced for sale abroad, for export. But also, the non-export oriented industry did well. In other words, things that West German factories made that were produced for the home market to be sold to West German people. And that was very much stimulated by the house building programme. So, for example, 1949 to 59, 5 million dwelling units were constructed. We say dwelling units rather than houses because in West Germany a lot of the production to accommodate families whose homes had been destroyed during the war was about building apartments, okay, that type of thing. Okay, so then the next strand, those are the key features of the economic miracle. The next strand is the reasons for the economic miracle. So again, we've covered this in the previous lesson. So it's just sort of pulling together a few concluding points. Okay, so the first one, we've talked about the Ordo liberals and how Erhard found this sort of new way which balanced halfway between state intervention and a laissez-faire approach. And that was very much supported by the Americans, because the Americans basically, they were propping up the West German economy, and the American line was basically to liberalise world trade. What they wanted, in other words, was they wanted open frontiers, they wanted free trade, they didn't want tariffs around national economies, because tariffs get in the way of buying and selling, exchanging goods between countries. What they wanted is a sort of more of an open world market, because if you've got an open market, you've got free movement of goods, which will therefore provide an incentive to businesses to produce goods for export, for selling abroad. Okay, so that's one of the factors why there was an economic boom. The second factor we've already covered, what we call the monetary policy carried out by a central bank. That's that sort of image of the tap turning on and off the supply of money into the economy, a monetary policy. And that, remember, that's the point is that's managed by a central bank, not managed by the government. It's not managed by politicians. Okay. Another factor, and we've covered this, of course, is that much of West Germany's industrial infrastructure, in particular machinery and industrial plant, what that basically means is factories, had survived World War II intact or in repairable condition. So it looked worse than it was. Okay, and also it's not mentioned there, but the skilled workforce, okay, was still there. So the little thing there means arrow means spare industrial capacity. So there was spare industrial capacity to respond to world demand for German products. Okay, D. Let me just sort of tick these off as we go along. I'll use my finger for this, so we've covered that. There we go, that. Okay, so D, the West German workforce remained moderate in its wage demands. Okay, so remember, we talked about that. Again, it's just revisiting what we've already said. This is the bit that's about how that a key part of controlling the economy is basically to ensure that that the unions don't have the power to sort of like impose demands on the government, for example, to impose wage restrictions as a way of making sure there's no inflation. Okay, so uniquely to West Germany, there's that word co-determination. Okay, it was introduced in 1951. And what that basically meant is large businesses with over 1,000 employees had to allow representatives of the workers onto the management committees, and they were called works councils. And what that basically did is it harmonised industrial relations. Okay, and very distinctive feature of the West German economy, therefore, is that in contrast to Britain, where regularly British workers went on strike because the workforce fell out with the bosses, okay, with the management. In West Germany, there was harmony in the workplace because the workers and the managers sat together in these workers' councils, co-determination, to talk things through. So in West Germany, there were very few days lost to strikes, whereas if you look at France and Britain in the 1950s, though that old model of industrial relations, which was the workers are organised into unions, and then there is bargaining that has to take place, which often causes conflicts. Okay, but in West Germany, although there were unions, they were very receptive to this social market economy, because Erhard, of course, warned that if the workers pushed for wage increases, it would cause inflation. So there needed to be constant conversations between management and workers about the need to work together to ensure that you didn't have an inflationary spiral. Okay, so that's a sort of key feature. And the other factor about the workforce is that in West Germany, an elaborate welfare system was created. Okay, and that also led to social peace. Okay, it meant that in the 1950s, in contrast to other countries such as Britain and France, where there was often social unrest. Okay, in Germany, there was very little discontent. The welfare system that was created, and remember, it wasn't the same as the British welfare system. In the British system, you've got high taxation, and the government revenue from taxation is used to provide welfare. But the problem with that is if you tax the people, it means there's less money in their pocket, which therefore reduces demand for consumer goods, etc., and therefore that could potentially restrict economic growth. And Erhard was very keen not to have a high taxation system. He wanted West German people to have as little taxation as possible so that they had greater spending power. And the idea of the West German welfare system was that they invest their additional wealth in welfare, in a welfare system, very similar to the Obamacare, for example, that was created by President Obama in America. So that was an important factor. Now, an example was a law passed in 1952 called the Equalization of Burdens Law, which over the next 20 years, as part of the welfare system, it was kind of like policed by the West German government, but it basically ensured that those people who had particularly suffered during World War II, suffered more than others, that there'd be a redistribution of wealth to those who needed it most, and that was again part of the welfare system that was created. Okay. Next point. These are all sort of like reasons for the mobility, for the economic growth. High degree of labour mobility. So labour basically means the workforce. Mobility means they could easily move around. Okay. Now the picture there kind of like goes with the text. What we tend to see in the 1950s is this. Okay. Historically, ever since 1871 all the way through to the 1940s, most of Germany's industry was based in the Ruhr area. There's a little map that shows where the Ruhr area was. It's in this sort of the northwest of West Germany. Okay, but a key feature of the 1950s is that the German workforce began to move away from those older industries of the Ruhr, and in the south of Germany, particularly in places like Baden and Württemberg and Bavaria, these sorts of areas in the south, you see new industries growing. Okay, and a feature of the 1950s was that on average 3 million Germans moved house each year. Okay, and much of that movement of the labour force was to the south and to the east. New types of industry that was being created. It was more sort of service industry, the banking sector, insurance, etc., those sorts of type of industry, rather than the old-fashioned raw industry, which was more manufacturing. And part of the reason for that is with the creation of machine tools, of course, machine tools could do the jobs of multiple people. So that therefore freed West German workers up to look for other types of work. And so there was social mobility. There was movement to the south. Next point, the labour force, the West German labour force, another key feature of the economic miracle, it was constantly boosted by that flow of young, skilled refugees from East Germany. Okay, so it's not, you can't see East Germany on this map because this map shows West Germany. But again, if you were sort of like to consider, we talked about this previously, there were many East Germans moving from East Germany into West Germany. Okay, and the reason for that will develop in Depth Study 5 was, of course, that this new country that was created in 1949 called East Germany, for a variety of reasons, it didn't have the same type of economic miracle. Okay, that was partly because it was mainly agricultural, whereas West Germany had most of the old industry. But it was also because, of course, East Germany fell under communist control. And one of the problems of the communist system is it disincentivized, it took away the incentive for people to work hard because there was no profit motive. So in the 1950s, there were still open borders between East Germany and West Germany. The closure of the borders didn't really happen until the very late 1950s, and then of course in 1961 the building of the Berlin Wall closed off that escape route completely. But in the 1950s, if you were an East German and you were free to move, it was quite easy to cross over to West Germany. Now of course the older generation of East Germans who have got families and got all those ties, it was not so easy for them to move. But if you were young and single and in particular skilled, many East Germans decided to cross over to West Germany, and they took all those skills with them into West Germany. And that's the sort of point there that's been made there. So the labour force in West Germany was being constantly boosted by a flow of young skilled refugees from East Germany. And statistics there, e.g. 1950 to 1962, 3.6 million refugees left the GDR. And that's been sort of quantified, but somebody worked out that that movement in that period added 2.6 billion Deutschmarks to the West German economy, which in sum total was much, much greater than the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan only contributed $1.5 billion. Okay, we're comparing different currencies there over 4 years. So that's an important feature of the economic miracle that you need to be aware of. West Germany was also initially spared the huge expense of rearmament in contrast to other countries is another feature. Okay, now we covered that if you remember when we did Depth Study 4, that West Germany was not a fully sovereign state. It did become an independent country. It had its own government, obviously led by Adenauer, the Chancellor, but you will hopefully remember that West Germany was not allowed to have its own foreign policy. Okay. And also it was not allowed to have its own army, at least not until the mid-1950s. Okay, so in the early 1950s, if you think about it, other countries like Britain and France, their governments had to invest quite a lot of expenditure funding their army. Well, West Germany didn't need to do that. It wasn't allowed to have an army by the terms of the Potsdam Agreement. that was part of the terms of the creation of West Germany as a separate state. You're not allowed to have an army. There was still that sort of like nervousness, particularly by the French, about, well, you know, we don't really want West Germany to have an army, so it was agreed West Germany didn't have to have an army. So that basically spared a huge expense. It meant that the West German government, you know, with all this economic growth and the wealth that was created, could utilise that wealth on other things, such as, for example, her welfare programme. Okay, West Germany had the full backing of NATO and the American military presence. That was their army, funded by the Americans. So that obviously was a factor that helped the economic miracle. Okay. Point number 3. This is sort of like the debate then, okay? So this is what we were talking about earlier, okay, about the different arguments. So historians debating, okay? So historians have debated whether this economic growth, did it reflect actually continuity? In other words, the restoration of the pre-war structure, okay? So in other words, it was picking up from what happened before World War II and just simply continuing that. Or was it something new? Okay, what we call the Modernization Debate. So let's just unpick that. So it's weighing up two different points of view. So one point of view is this, okay, what we call the restoration, restoring the past, the continuity. Okay, what's the evidence? Well, West Germany's main exports in the 1950s, okay, the sort of big areas that really boomed in the 1950s, were in fact those same areas where Germany was preeminent before World War II. So we've already talked about that. You go back to the 1870s and the old Second Reich was preeminent in electrical engineering, in chemical industries, precision tools, etc., etc. And it's no coincidence those were the same areas of production that did well in the economic miracle of the 1950s. So there's kind of like the argument that the 1950s were a restoration of the old. Okay. Another one, that if you actually look at the industrialists and the managers, particularly in heavy industry, that these managers tried to cling on to Germany's old organised cartel system that had flourished since the 1890s. Do you remember that we did about cartels? How big, similar businesses who made the same type of product would often combine and set the rules themselves for their sector that they're making for, and they would define the prices and they would define the rules of the game. Okay, and so this historian Berghahn sort of argued that actually, if you look at the way the West German economy operated, although strictly speaking cartels had been disbanded at the end of World War II, actually the sort of that type of practice crept back in, and those powerful older traditions and attitudes sort of enjoyed a bit of an afterlife. So again, that's part of the argument about restoration, about continuity with the past. Okay, but there's a counterpoint of view. Okay, and some historians equally argue that no, the 1950s was very different from anything that happened in the past. Okay, that it reflected new trends, new things that hadn't been there in the past. It was a break from the past. In other words, it was evidence of modernization. Okay. So what's the evidence there? Well, that first point, okay, the context of the 1950s is incredibly different, isn't it? Okay, the global context in particular is that unlike anything that's happened in the past, you've got the West German economy is fully integrated and backed on a global scale because it's part of the Cold War context. Okay, and that made it very, very different. Whereas if you look at economic growth in the past, for example, in Germany in the 1920s, that there was always that suspicion of Germany. Okay, Germany was the defeated power from World War One. It was tied down by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. It was tied down by reparations deals. The rest of the world never really sort of gave the old Germany the chance for economic growth, whereas now it's very different. It's been actively supported because of the Cold War. Point number two, before 1839, 15% of Germany's exports went to Eastern and Southeastern Europe. We covered that last time, do you remember? That under Hitler, because Hitler was eastward looking, he very much tied Germany's economy in terms of exports and imports to Eastern Europe and Southeastern Europe in particular. Again, you may want to go back and check your notes on that one we did about the German economy under Hitler. In particular, Schacht's new plan had what we call these bilateral trade agreements with countries in Eastern Europe. West Germany was fundamentally the opposite. By 1950, West Germany's trade with Eastern Europe had shrunk to just 2% of her trade. Tiny fraction. And the bulk of West Germany's exports went to Western European countries because this new West Germany was fundamentally westward looking. We've done about Adenauer and Western integration. And in fact, of course, remember the Hallstein Doctrine, that because Adenauer refused to recognise any country that recognised the existence of East Germany, that basically that meant that countries had a choice. If they wanted to trade with West Germany, they had to reject any links with countries behind the Iron Curtain. So West Germany was fully integrated with the Western world and turned its back on the Eastern world. So as a result of this, West Germany had full access to the expanded markets that were created by the ECSC, the European Coal and Steel Community, and of course the EEC that was created in 1957. Okay, so next point. Okay, the influence of America and the anti-cartel legislation. So what's the key points here? So this sort of a point, coming back to this sort of point about cartels. Okay. So we'll develop this one. So point A, okay, strong influence on the organisation and culture of West German industry in the medium term. That's America and anti-cartel legislation, okay. Younger industrial managers in West Germany were very influenced by American management techniques, okay. And, for example, the way in which factories rationalised the way they made things, conveyor belt technology, etc., etc. Okay, they were very influenced by the way the Americans manufactured goods. So that was a sort of key feature. Having standardised production methods, that production, whatever was made in the factories, was closely linked to consumerism, what the market actually wanted, and prosperity. So if the market demand increased, production would increase to match the demand. If the market demand for a particular type of commodity declined, then the factories would shift to make something else. It was very much the American way of doing things. So the West German economic miracle was very much copied the American way of doing things. That's the point that's being made there. Okay. Now, Erhard himself fully believed and agreed with the American attitude towards competition. Okay. In other words, competition is good for economic growth. We want to have competition. And of course, the argument is if you have cartels or too many cartels, it reduces competition. And that's what was one of the big problems of Germany before, well, particularly Germany in the Second Reich. There were these huge industrial cartels, and if production is monopolised by just 2 or 3 massive businesses like AEG and Siemens, that it actually reduces competition because it pushes smaller businesses out of the market. They simply can't compete with these big cartels. So in 1953, Erhard introduced an Anti-Cartel Bill that broke up those big monopolies, and it actually outlawed trusts and cartels. Okay, and he proposed the creation of a government office, a government department, whose job it was to oversee the way in which German businesses worked, to make sure that there wasn't a natural movement towards the formation of great big cartel agreements. Okay, so that the competition within German industry would be preserved, that small businesses could continue to exist and compete freely. Okay, so it was designed to protect the sort of small businesses. And there's the photograph there on the right is of the federal cartel officers in the West German capital city, Bonn, and that was the job of that particular government department. And that Anti-Cartel Bill that was passed in 1953, Erhard felt it was so important, he often called it the economic basic law. Now, you've done the basic law. The basic law was the constitution of West Germany that defined how politics worked. Well, the anti-cartel law, nicknamed the economic basic law, it was called the economic basic law because it basically worked in the same way. It defined the rules for economic competition. Okay, now it took a long time. It wasn't until 1957 that the bill became law. So cartels continued to operate until 1957 in West Germany. Hence, the Bergahn argument that we talked about earlier would argue, well, actually, much of West Germany's economic miracle happened before the Anti-Cartel Bill became law. So therefore, surely cartels may have contributed to economic growth. Okay, and undoubtedly there was strong opposition to Erhard from many of those old raw industrialists and also several ministers, which included Adenauer himself as the Chancellor, was very reluctant to break up the old cartels. So, bit of a debate amongst historians, therefore, okay, because the cartels were not officially broken up until the very late 1950s, at which point much of the economic growth had happened. So did the cartels contribute to economic growth, or did they impede economic growth? Different historians have got different views. Okay. The next point, okay, there's quite a lot to cover in this strand. Pan-Europeanism and the European coal and steel community. So again, we've covered this in the first 3 lessons. We've talked about the ECSC and the growth of the EEC and how West Germany was closely linked to Western Europe economically. So what are the key points? Just pulling this together, what are the key points? Okay, so point A, we've already covered that. Adenauer believed that West Germany's economic future was intrinsically linked to the USA and integrating with Western Europe. Okay, so we've covered that. We did all about Western integration, how we did that depth study 4, how Adenauer, the West German Chancellor, absolutely believed if West Germany was going to not just develop and grow as a new country, but to continue to exist and survive as a new country, she needed to work with America and with Western Europe. Okay. Point B, Nazi nationalism. Okay. Of course, under Hitler, Germany was very inward looking, wasn't it? Okay. The value was that we focus on developing our own country. We don't, Hitler wanted Germany to be self-sufficient. Hitler wanted to basically close Germany off from the rest of the world so that Germany could exist by itself. Okay, so Nazi nationalism, of course, is very much the opposite of what West Germany was about. So that's what we call, when we talk about the ideological backlash. Okay, younger Germans so this younger Germans who had grown up and had been indoctrinated by Nazi ideas, to some extent resisted this sort of idea. Okay, so the point is that especially amongst younger Germans, some even backed the idea of a complete movement away from nation states towards a united Europe. This was a hotly sort of debated idea. Do we want to integrate with the rest of Europe? Because under Hitler, there had been a movement away from that. Point C, France was afraid of a revived united Germany, and therefore France supported the idea of West Germany's integration into a united Western European economic organisation, which would make the reunification of Germany much more difficult. Okay, so the point here is, of course, that once Germany split into two, West Germany and East Germany, of course, France quite liked that, okay, because a divided Germany was less of a threat to France. And in addition to that, if this new West Germany was fully integrated into a united Western European organisation, that would give Britain and France and Western European countries a degree of control over this new country called West Germany. So all of these factors in which West Germany fully moved towards an integration with Western Europe were factors that, of course, made reunification of Germany, coming together of West and East Germany back together into a big single country, much more difficult. Okay, so that was a sort of key pressure point. Point D, of course, in April 1951, the European Coal and Steel Community was formed. We've covered that. That was a combination of the heavy industrial sectors of France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands and Luxembourg into a single market area. And again, we've covered this, that Adenauer's government, the West German government, supported the formation of the ECSC for two reasons. Okay, first of all, politically, they hoped that if West Germany cooperated with the ECSC, it would result in West Germany being accepted as a new cooperative member of the post-war Europe. So there was a political motivation for West Germany to be part of the ECSC, and then there was an economic motive. Okay, because if West Germany belonged to the ECSC, then that would provide an expanded market for West Germany to trade her goods with other countries. Okay, so again, just pull back a little bit. There's the map, and the text underneath, as you see, says West Germany joined the ECSC in 1951, the beginning of a long history of close integration into Western Europe, which continues today with the European community. And then, of course, the ECSC in 1957 became the European Economic Community. It expanded and became the EEC in 1957, and bit by bit other countries joined the EEC, including Britain joining green in 1973. Okay, so West Germany being one of the founding members of the ECSC, which then became the EEC, and the EEC growing and continuing to be important to this day, is another sort of key feature and reason why West Germany did so well. So what are the key points there? Just to, again, a lot of this is just recap, things we covered already. So point A, the success of the ECSC spurred the 6 member nations to expand, and 2 years of negotiations between 1955 and 1957 led ultimately to the Treaty of Rome. Okay, and the Treaty of Rome was the agreement turn the ECSC into the European Economic Community, or Common Market as it's sometimes called, which of course is still with us today. And what the EEC basically did once it was formed is it abolished trade tariffs between member states, so there's complete open movement of goods without having to pay taxes to move goods from one country to another. Okay, and that had a huge benefit for West Germany. It stimulated her export industry. Okay, so as a result of that, with the industrial takeoff in West Germany, there was a huge demand for West German industrial products in other countries like France and Britain. And we look at that, and by 1981, 45% of West German exports went to other members of the EEC, while 47% of Germany's imports came from within the EEC. So in other words, nearly half of West Germany's imports and exports were within the EEC, and that's still a factor today. Okay, West Germany has now become Germany because it was reunified with the East in 1990, but that sort of germ of West Germany being the heart of the EEC is still very much a factor today. So the result of that is the EEC, which included Britain, of course, until recently, became very, very heavily dependent on West Germany's membership, okay, because West Germany was at the heart of the EEC. West Germany sustained many of the EEC's policies because the West German contribution to the EEC budget was so substantial. Okay, and that sort of close link between West Germany and the EEC had political benefits, political spin-offs for West Germany. Because if West Germany is trading closely with Western European countries, then it means that West Germany had leverage, political leverage. It could influence other matters within other Western European countries, such as Spain and Britain and France, Italy and so on. Okay, so to this day the EC continues to be dependent on Germany's central role. There's a map there that sort of shows that. Okay, next, nearly there, challenges from the 1960s onwards. Okay, so that's the 1950s. What about since the 1950s? Okay, well, by the end of the 1950s the boom was over. Okay, new challenges began to appear, typical of a mature industrial economy. So, for example, West Germany's coal industry fell into decline. Remember the earlier map I showed you how there was a movement away from the Ruhr down to the south of Germany. About 3 million Germans in the 1950s moved from the Ruhr area to places like Bavaria and began to sort of like take up new types of jobs in new types of industry, service industry, banking, insurance, etc. That's what this is about. Industry was switching to cheaper oil. Okay, coal, of course, was the traditional fuel for West Germany's factories, and the coal came from the Ruhr. But by the 1960s, there is other fuel, and in particular oil, which was imported from the Middle East, and that was much, much cheaper. So if you're a German businessman, it was actually cheaper to buy oil for your factories and turn to oil fuel than to use domestic coal. So therefore, West Germany's coal industry fell into decline, and also the West German economy began to shift from heavy industry to a type of economy based more on service industry. Hence the movement from the north of Germany down to the south in terms of labour mobility. 1958 is generally seen as sort of like the peak year of the economic miracle. Pretty much by 1958 there was full employment. All West Germans were in work. Okay, but the problem is that when you've got full employment, you've got a shortage of labour. Okay, it sounds great, everyone's got a job, but if you're a businessman and you want to attract new workers to work in your factory because your business is doing so well and everyone is in work, then you've got problems. Okay, how are you going to do that? The only way you can do that is to basically say, I'll pay you more if you come and work for me. And that might attract people to come and work in your business, but then if you're going to pay them more, you've got to increase your prices of the goods when you sell your goods on the market, which will therefore possibly impact on demand, or people won't want to buy your goods. Okay, so how do you address that? So that was partly solved by businesses, German businesses, recruiting cheap foreign workers moving into Germany from other countries, and this is what we call the guest workers, Gastarbeiter. Okay, there's a photograph there that shows guest workers were a common feature. Many of them came from the Mediterranean, in particular from Turkey. Okay, moving from southern European countries, mainly in the 1950s, 60s and 70s, seeking work as part of a formal guest worker program. Okay. So by 1963, if you look at the West German labour market, approximately 3.7% of West Germany's labour force were workers who had moved into Germany from southern Europe. Okay, so that's part of the problem resulting from full employment. Full employment also encouraged greater wage demands, as we said. Okay, if you're going to attract workers for your business, you're going to have to increase the wages because there's full employment. So what we start to see is after 1958, and particularly by 1962, wage levels were rising faster than productivity. Okay, so it's starting to create that sort of inflationary spiral that we've already talked about. And in the first half of the 1960s, then, for the first time, West Germany fell behind other European countries. Countries such as Italy and France overtook the West German economy. Okay. Then as we move into the 1970s, the West German economy experienced inflationary pressures. Okay. So what does that basically mean? Well, the 1970s, by the 1970s, this was a global phenomenon. Most countries were dependent upon, in terms of fuel, as we said earlier, were buying oil from the Middle East. That was their main fuel for their businesses. But there was political conflict in the Middle East. In the early 1970s, there were wars in the Middle East, and as a result of that, the supply of oil from the Middle East was reduced. So oil, therefore, was a shortage commodity, and when you've got a shortage commodity, prices go up. So basically, West German businesses, manufacturing businesses that were reliant on oil from the Middle East, had to hike the prices of the goods that they produced to be able to cover the oil costs. Okay, so if you're going to basically have to pay for very expensive oil to keep your machines running to make your goods, you're going to have to basically put the prices of your goods up on the market. So that basically caused inflation. Another factor in the 1970s is unemployment rose. Okay, in Germany, in West Germany in the 1970s. Again, many businesses couldn't compete. They started to close down. That was a global phenomenon. It was a decade of recession. Although West Germany did weather that globally better than other countries. And then in the 1980s, growth rates improved again. Inflation was stabilised and unemployment fell. So get to 1990, which is the final year of our course. Our course is 1871 to 1990. West Germany was the world's third strongest industrial estate. Okay, its economy was still the envy of Europe. It was still far superior to the command economies, socialist economies in the East, beyond the Iron Curtain, the economies of the USSR and the satellite states. But I suppose the point is there were ups and downs. The 1970s was a period of downturn. Okay, likewise the 1980s, things began to improve. So ups and downs. So the point is the economic miracle that started after World War II didn't continue all the way through to 1990. It did go into a dip and then it recovered a little bit in the 1980s. Just giving you that sort of overview there. Okay. So conclusion. Okay. What are the sort of key things? Erhard had successfully tamed the cartels. He'd encouraged free enterprise and he nearly halved West Germany's protective tariffs. Okay, so West Germany was now fully trading with the rest of the world. There were no longer protective tariffs around West Germany. Okay. By 1963, West Germany's economy was the strongest in Europe, stable prices, impressive export growth, high levels of internal investment. However, in some ways, West Germany was only a limited social market economy. Remember, there was still state intervention in some areas. Okay, farming was still heavily subsidised. We'll do that next lesson. Okay, there were some aspects of the economy where you still had quite strong state intervention. Okay, other weaknesses: cost of social welfare was increasingly a burden. Okay, remember we talked about unemployment in the 1970s, so that became an issue for the West German government. And another point is some social market economists felt that the EEC, which West Germany was a driving force for, at the heart of, here's a nice word for you, was a potentially dirigist and bureaucratic organisation. We'll pick this up in the next lesson when we look at agriculture. Okay, dirigism or dirigism, from the French diriger, meaning to direct, is an economic system where the state exerts a strong directive influence over investment. It designates a capitalist economy in which the state plays a strong directive role as opposed to a merely regulatory one. A bit of a mouthful there, but what this is basically saying is that in its purest form, when Erhard introduced the social market economy, the state was the market policeman. Okay, it wasn't a burdensome thing such as in the Soviet Union, a socialist type command economy. It was a market economy. The whole idea is that there shouldn't be a big bureaucracy controlling the economy. It should be an open, free market economy, allowing supply and demand to operate according to natural rules. But the point is, with the passage of time, and in particular with West Germany joining the EEC, that particularly the EEC had quite a strong bureaucracy, and that bureaucracy cost quite a lot of money to maintain, and arguably West Germany became sort of like caught up in that bureaucracy of the EEC. That was quite expensive to maintain, and that over time became quite stifling and sort of like restricted West German economic growth. Very pertinent because, of course, one of the reasons why Britain, for example, decided to, with the Brexit vote, and it was very divisive in Britain with that vote, but one of the arguments used by Brexit was that the EEC imposed a dirigist demand, a burden on the British economy, okay, which Britain needed to free herself from. Okay, so that's the sort of key point there. Okay, so there we go. Big topic. We spent effectively, well, 4 proper talk lessons plus this finishing off video. So it's almost 5 hours to sort of cover this big topic, but it's a hugely important topic because it integrates with Depth Study 4. It gives you lots of information you can use for that, and it also sits at the heart of the breadth study economic growth 1871 to 1990 topic in section C. So that's it. Next lesson we will look at agriculture. No flip learning for that. Okay. Take a bit of a break and I'll just teach you the agricultural side from scratch. Okay, thanks very much. Hopefully that was useful for you. I'll sign off now.